When it comes to the political scene, few people have made as much of a stir or impact as Bernie Sanders. He's been embraced by young and old alike. Some of his ideas and principles have all sides of the politics-driven landscape talking. He's causing a lot of discussion, and at the end of the day, discussion is always a good thing. But who is Sanders? Where did he come from? What is his history? Let's take an in-depth look. Bernard Sanders is an American politician who has served as the junior United States Senator from Vermont since 2007. Vermont's at-large congressman from 1991 to 2007, he is the longest-serving independent in U.S. congressional history and a member of the Democratic caucus. Sanders ran unsuccessfully for the 2016 Democratic nomination for president and is running again in 2020. A self-described Democratic socialist and progressive, Sanders is known for his opposition to economic inequality. On domestic policy, he broadly supports labor rights and has supported universal and single-payer health care, paid paternal leave, and tuition-free tertiary. On foreign policy, he broadly supports reducing military spending, pursuing more diplomacy and international cooperation, and putting greater emphasis on labor rights and environmental concerns when negotiating international trade agreements. Sanders was born and raised in the Brooklyn borough of New York City and attended Brooklyn College before graduating from the University of Chicago in 1964. While a student, he was an active protest organizer for the Congress of Racial Equality and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee during the Civil Rights Movement. After settling in Vermont in 1968, Sanders ran unsuccessful third-party political campaigns in the early to mid-1970s. As an independent, he was elected mayor of Burlington in 1981 by a margin of 10 votes. He was re-elected 3 times. He won election to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1990, representing Vermont's at-large congressional district. He later co-founded the Congressional Progressive Caucus. Sanders served as a U.S. representative for 16 years before being elected to the U.S. Senate in 2006. He was re-elected to the Senate in 2012 and 2018. In April 2015, Sanders announced his campaign for the 2016 Democratic nomination for President of the United States. Despite initially low expectations, he went on to win 23 primaries and caucuses and approximately 43% of pledged delegates to Hillary Clinton's 55%. His campaign was noted for its supporters' enthusiasm, as well as for his rejection of large donations from corporations, the financial industry, and any associated super PAC. In July 2016, he formally endorsed Clinton in her general election campaign against Republican Donald Trump, while urging his supporters to continue the political revolution his campaign began. In February 2019, Sanders announced a second presidential campaign, joining multiple other Democratic candidates pursuing the party nomination. Sanders was born on September 8, 1941, in Brooklyn, New York City. His father, Elias Ben Yehuda Sanders, was born in Slopnice, Galicia, in Austria-Hungary, which is now part of Poland, to a Jewish family. In 1921, Elias immigrated to the United States, where he became a paint salesman. His mother, Dorothy Sanders, was born in New York City to Jewish immigrant parents from Poland and Russia. Sanders became interested in politics at an early age. In the 1940s, many of Sanders' relatives in German-occupied Poland were murdered in the Holocaust. A guy named Adolf Hitler won an election in 1932, said Sanders in an interview about his choice to get into politics. He won an election and 50 million people died as a result of that election in World War II, including 6 million Jews. So what I learned as a little kid is that politics is, in fact, very important. Sanders lived in Midwood, Brooklyn. He attended elementary school at PS 197 in Brooklyn, where he won a borough championship on the basketball team. He attended Hebrew school in the afternoons and celebrated his bar mitzvah in 1954. Sanders' older brother, Larry, said that during their childhood, the family never lacked for food or clothing, but major purchases, like curtains or a rug, were not affordable. Sanders attended James Madison High School, also in Brooklyn, where he was captain of the track team and took third place in the New York City indoor 1-mile race. In high school, Sanders lost his first election, finishing last out of 3 candidates for the student body presidency. Not long after his high school graduation, his mother died at the age of 46. His father died a few years later, on August 4th, 1962, at the age of 57. Sanders studied at Brooklyn College for a year in 1959 through 1960 before transferring to the University of Chicago and graduating with a Bachelor of Arts degree in political science in 1964. He has described himself as a mediocre college student because the classroom was boring and irrelevant, while the community was more important in his education. Sanders later described his time in Chicago as the major period of intellectual ferment in my life. While there, he joined the Young People's Socialist League, which is the youth affiliate of the Socialist Party of America, and was active in the civil rights movement as a student for the Congress of Racial Equality, known as CORE for short, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or the SNCC. Under Sanders' chairmanship, the university chapter of CORE merged with the university chapter of SNCC. In January 1962, Sanders went to a rally at the University of Chicago Administration Building to protest University President George Wells Beatty's segregated campus housing policy. "We feel it is an intolerable situation when Negro and white students of the university cannot live together in university-owned apartments," Sanders said at the protests. Sanders and 32 other students then entered the building and camped outside the president's office. After weeks of sit-in, Beadle and the university formed a commission to investigate discrimination. Following further protests, the University of Chicago ended official racial segregation in private university housing in the summer of 1963. Joan Mahoney, a member of the University of Chicago CORE chapter at the time and a fellow participant in the sit-ins, described Sanders in a 2016 interview as a swell guy, a nice Jewish boy from Brooklyn, but he wasn't terribly charismatic. One of his strengths, though, was his ability to work with a wide group of people, even those he didn't agree with. Sanders once spent a day putting up flyers protesting against police brutality, only to eventually notice that a Chicago police car was shadowing him and taking them all down. Sanders attended the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his "I Have a Dream" speech. That summer, Sanders was fined $25 for resisting arrest during a demonstration in Inglewood against segregation in Chicago's public schools. In addition to his civil rights activism during the 1960s and 1970s, Sanders was active in several peace and anti-war movements. He was a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Student Peace Union while attending the University of Chicago. Sanders applied for conscientious objector status during the Vietnam War. His application was eventually turned down, by which point he was too old to be drafted. Although he opposed the war, Sanders never criticized those who fought and has been a strong supporter of veterans' benefits. He also was briefly an organizer with the United Packing House Workers of America while in Chicago. Sanders also worked on the re-election campaign of Leon Dupre, a prominent Chicago alderman who was opposed to Mayor Richard J. Daley's Democratic Party machine. During his student years, He also read a variety of American and European political authors, from Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, and John Dewey to Karl Marx and Erich Fromm. Professional history. After graduating from college, Sanders returned to New York City, where he initially worked at a variety of jobs, including Head Start teacher, psychiatric aide, and carpenter. In 1968, he moved to Vermont because he had been captivated by rural life. After his arrival there, he worked as a carpenter, filmmaker, and writer who created and sold radical film strips and other educational materials to schools. He also wrote several articles for the alternative publication, The Vermont Freeman. Sanders began his electoral political career in 1971 as a member of the Liberty Union Party, which originated in the anti-war movement and the People's Party. He ran as the Liberty Union candidate for governor of Vermont in 1972 and 1976, and as a candidate for the U.S. Senator in 1972 and 1974. In the 1974 senatorial race, Sanders finished third, behind 33-year-old Chittenden County State's Attorney Patrick Leahy and two-term incumbent U.S. Representative Dick Mallory. The 1976 campaign proved to be the zenith of Liberty Union's influence, with Sanders collecting 11,000 votes for governor and the party. This forced the races for lieutenant governor and secretary of state to be decided by the state legislature when its vote total prevented either the Republican or Democratic candidates for those offices from garnering a majority of votes. The campaign drained the finances and energy of the Liberty Union. However, and in October 1977, less than a year after the conclusion of the 1976 campaign, Sanders and the Liberty Union candidate for Attorney General, Nancy Kaufman, announced their retirement from the party. Following his resignation from the Liberty Union Party in 1977, Sanders worked as a writer and a director of the nonprofit APHS, American People's Historical Society. While with the APHS, he made a 30-minute documentary about American socialist leader and presidential candidate Eugene V. Debs. In 1980, Sanders ran for mayor of Burlington, Vermont, at the suggestion of his close friend and political confidant, Richard Sugarman, a professor of religion at the University of Vermont. He was mayor for 8 years, from April 6, 1981 to April 4, 1989. The 39-year-old Sanders ran against incumbent Democratic Mayor Gordon "Gordy" Paquette, a 5-term mayor who had served as a member of the Burlington City Council for 13 years before that, building extensive community ties and a willingness to cooperate with Republican leaders in controlling appointments to various commissions. Republicans had found Paquette so unobjectionable that they failed to field a candidate in the March 1981 race against him, leaving Sanders as his principal opponent. Sanders' effort was further aided by the decision of the candidate of the Citizen Party, Greg Guma, to exit the race so as not to split the progressive vote. Two other candidates in the race, independents Richard Bove and Joe McGrath, proved to be essentially non-factors in the campaign, with the battle coming down to Paquette and Sanders. Sanders castigated the pro-development incumbent as an ally of prominent shopping center developer Antonio Pomelo, while Paquette warned of ruin for Burlington if Sanders was elected. The Sanders campaign was bolstered by a wave of optimistic volunteers, as well as by a series of endorsements from university professors, social welfare agencies, and the police union. The final result came as a shock to local political establishment, with the Maverick Sanders winning by just 10 votes. Sanders was re-elected 3 times, defeating both Democratic and Republican candidates. He received 53% of the vote in 1983 and 55% in 1985. In his final run for mayor in 1987, Sanders defeated Paul Lafayette, a Democrat endorsed by both major parties. In 1986, Sanders unsuccessfully challenged incumbent governor Madeleine Kunin in her run for re-election. Running as an independent, Sanders finished third with 14% of the vote. Kunin won with 47%, followed by Lieutenant Governor Peter P. Smith with 38%. After serving 4 two-year terms, Sanders chose not to seek re-election in 1989. He lectured in political science at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government that year and at Hamilton College in 1991. During his mayoralty, Sanders called himself a socialist and was so described in the press. During his first term, his supporters, including the first Citizens Party city councilor, Terry Bouricius, formed the Progressive Coalition, the forerunner of the Vermont Progressive Party. The Progressives never held more than 6 seats on the 13-member city council, but they had enough to keep the council from overriding Sanders' vetoes. Under Sanders, Burlington became the first city in the country to fund community trust housing. During the 1980s, Sanders was a consistent critic of U.S. foreign policy in Latin America. In 1985, Burlington City Hall hosted a foreign policy speech by Noam Chomsky. In his introduction, Sanders praised Chomsky as a very vocal and important voice in the wilderness of intellectual life in America, and said he was delighted to welcome a person who I think we're all very proud of. Sanders' administration balanced the city budget and drew a minor league baseball team, the Vermont Reds, then the AA affiliate of the Cincinnati Reds, to Burlington. Under his leadership, Burlington sued the local television cable franchise, winning reduced rates for customers. As mayor, Sanders led extensive downtown revitalization projects. One of his primary achievements was the improvement of Burlington's Lake Champlain waterfront. In 1981, Sanders campaigned against the unpopular plans by Burlington developer Tony Pomelo to convert the then industrial waterfront property owned by the Central Vermont Railway into expensive condominiums, hotels, and offices. Sanders ran under the slogan, "Burlington is not for sale," and successfully supported a plan that redeveloped the waterfront area into a mixed-use district featuring housing, parks, and public space. Today, the waterfront area includes many parks and miles of public beach and bike paths, a boathouse, and a science center. Sanders hosted and produced a public access television program, Bernie Speaks with the Community, from 1986 to 1988. He collaborated with 30 Vermont musicians to record a folk album, We Shall Overcome, in 1987. In 1987, U.S. News and World Report ranked Sanders one of America's best mayors. As of 2013, Burlington was regarded as one of the most livable cities in the nation. Sanders' 1990 victory made him the first independent candidate to be elected to Congress since Fraser Reams in 1950. It was noted by the Washington Post and others as the first election of a socialist to the United States House of Representatives in decades. Sanders served in the House from 1991 until he became a senator in 2007. In 1988, incumbent Republican Congressman Jim Jeffords decided to run for the U.S. Senate, vacating the House seat representing Vermont's at-large congressional district. Former Lieutenant Governor Peter P. Smith won the House election with a plurality, securing 41% of the vote. Sanders, who ran as an independent, placed second with 38% of the vote, while Democratic State Representative Paul N. Poirier placed third with 19% of the vote. 2 years later, Sanders ran for the seat again and defeated Smith by a margin of 56% to 39%. Sanders was the first independent elected to the U.S. House of Representatives since Fraser Reams' election to represent Ohio 40 years earlier. He served as a representative for 16 years, winning re-election by large margins except during the 1994 Republican Revolution, when he won by 3%, with 50% of the vote. During his first year in the House, Sanders often alienated allies and colleagues with his criticism of both political parties, as working primarily on behalf of the wealthy. In 1991, Sanders co-founded the Congressional Progressive Caucus, a group of mostly liberal Democrats that Sanders chaired for his first 8 years, while still refusing to join the Democratic Party or caucus. In 1993, Sanders voted against the Brady Bill, which mandated federal background checks when buying guns and imposed a waiting period on firearm purchasers in the United States. The bill passed by a vote of 238 to 187. He voted against the bill 4 more times in the 1990s. In 1994, Sanders voted in favor of the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act. He said he voted for the bill because it included the Violence Against Women Act and the ban on certain assault weapons. He was nevertheless extremely critical of the other parts of the bill, although he acknowledged that clearly there are some people in our society who are horribly violent, who are deeply sick and sociopathic, and clearly these people must be put behind bars in order to protect society from them. He maintained in his intervention before the House that the government's ill-thought policies played a large part in dooming tens of millions of young people to a future of bitterness, misery, hopelessness, drugs, crime, and violence. In this same intervention, he argued that the repressive policies introduced by the bill were not addressing the causes of violence, stating that we can create meaningful jobs, rebuilding our society, or we can build more jails. In 1998, Sanders voted for a bill that would have increased minimum sentencing for possession of a gun while committing a federal crime to 10 years in prison, including nonviolent crimes such as marijuana possession. In 1999, Sanders voted and advocated against rolling back the Glass-Steagall legislation provisions that kept investment banks and commercial banks separate entities. He was a vocal critic of Federal Reserve Chair Alan Greenspan. In June 2003, during a question and answer discussion with the then chairman, Sanders told him that he was concerned that Greenspan was way out of touch and that you see your major function in your position as the need to represent the wealthy and large corporations. In 2005, Sanders voted for the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act. The act's purpose was to prevent firearm manufacturers and dealers from being held liable for negligence when crimes have been committed with their products. As of 2016, Sanders has said that he has changed his position and would vote for legislation to defeat this bill. Sanders was a consistent critic of the Patriot Act. As a member of Congress, he voted against the original Patriot Act legislation. After its 357-66 passage in the House, Sanders sponsored and voted for several subsequent amendments and acts attempting to curtail its effects, and voted against each reauthorization. In June 2005, he proposed an amendment to limit Patriot Act provisions that allowed the government to obtain individuals' library and book buying records. The amendment passed the House by a bipartisan majority, but was removed on November 4th of that year in House-Senate negotiations and never became law. Sanders voted against the resolutions authorizing the use of force against Iraq in 1991 and 2002, and opposed the 2003 invasion of Iraq. He voted for the 2001 authorization for use of military force against terrorists that has been cited as the legal justification for controversial military actions since the September 11th attacks. Sanders voted for a non-binding resolution expressing support for troops at the outset of the invasion of Iraq, but gave a floor speech criticizing the partisan nature of the vote and the George W. Bush administration's actions in the run-up to the war. Regarding the investigation of what turned out to be a leak of CIA agent Valerie Plame's identity by a State Department official, Sanders stated, "The revelation that the president authorized the release of classified information in order to discredit an Iraq war critic should tell every member of Congress that the time is now for a serious investigation of how we got into the war in Iraq and why Congress can no longer act as a rubber stamp for the president." Sanders entered the race for the U.S. Senate on April 21, 2005, after Senator Jim Jeffords announced that he would not seek a fourth term. Chuck Schumer, chairman of the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, endorsed Sanders, a critical move as it meant that no Democrat running against Sanders could expect to receive financial help from the party. Sanders was also endorsed by Senate Minority Leader Harry Reid of Nevada and Democratic National Committee Chairman and former Vermont Governor Howard Dean. Dean said in May 2005 that he considered Sanders an ally who votes with the Democrats 98% of the time. Then Senator Barack Obama also campaigned for Sanders in Vermont in March 2006. Sanders entered into an agreement with the Democratic Party, much as he had as a congressman, to be listed in their primary but to decline the nomination should he win, which he did. In the most expensive political campaign in Vermont's history, Sanders defeated businessman Rich Tarrant by an approximately 2-to-1 margin. Many national media outlets projected Sanders as the winner just after the polls closed, before any returns came in. He was re-elected in 2012 with 71% of the vote, and in 2018 with 67% of the vote. On September 24, 2008, Sanders posted an open letter to Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson decrying the initial bank bailout proposal. It drew more than 8,000 citizen co-signers in 24 hours. On January 26, 2009, Sanders and Democrats Robert Byrd, Russ Feingold, and Tom Harkin were the sole majority members to vote against confirming Timothy Geithner as United States Secretary of the Treasury. In 2008 and 2009, Sanders voted against the Troubled Asset Relief Program, also known as the Wall Street Bailout, a program to purchase toxic banking assets and provide loans to banks that were in freefall. Among his proposed financial reforms is the auditing of the Federal Reserve, which would reduce the independence of the Federal Reserve in monetary policy deliberations. Federal Reserve officials say that Audit the Fed legislation would expose the Federal Reserve to undue political pressure from lawmakers who do not like its decisions. On December 10, 2010, Sanders delivered an 8.5-hour speech against the Tax Relief, Unemployment Insurance Reauthorization, and Job Creation Act of 2010, the proposed extension of the Bush-era tax rates that eventually became law, arguing that the legislation would favor the wealthiest Americans. "Enough is enough. How many homes can you own?" he asked. A long speech such as this is commonly known as a filibuster, but because it did not block action, it was not technically a filibuster under Senate rules. In response to the speech, hundreds of people signed online petitions urging Sanders to run in the 2012 presidential election, and pollsters began measuring his support in key primary states. Progressive activists such as Rabbi Michael Lerner and economist David Korten publicly voiced their support for a prospective Sanders run against President Barack Obama. Sanders' speech was published in February 2011 by Nation's Books as The Speech, a historic filibuster on corporate greed and the decline of our middle class, with authorial proceeds going to Vermont nonprofit charitable organizations. In 2016, Sanders voted for the Federal Reserve Transparency Act, which included proposals for a reformed audit of the Federal Reserve System. Before his 2016 presidential run, Sanders was known as a legislator who advocated for progressive causes, but rarely forged actual legislation or left a significant imprint on it. According to the New York Times, big legislation largely eludes Mr. Sanders because his ideas are usually far to the left of the majority of the Senate. Mr. Sanders has largely found ways to press his agenda through appending small provisions to the larger bills of others. During his time in the Senate, Sanders had lower legislative effectiveness than the average senator, as measured by the number of sponsored bills that passed and successful amendments made. Sanders announced his intention to seek the Democratic Party's nomination for President of the United States on April 30th, 2015, and his campaign was officially launched on May 26, 2015, in Burlington. In his announcement, Sanders said, "I don't believe that the men and women who defended American democracy fought to create a situation where billionaires owned the political process," and made this a central idea throughout his campaign. Senator Elizabeth Warren welcomed Sanders' entry into the race, saying, "I'm glad to see him get out there and give his version of what leadership in this country should be," but never endorsed him. Initially considered a long shot, Sanders won 23 primaries and caucuses and approximately 46% of pledged delegates to Clinton's 54%. His campaign was noted for its supporters' enthusiasm, as well as for his rejection of large donations from corporations, the financial industry, and any associated super PAC. Some of the Democratic National Committee emails leaked to the public in June and July 2016 showed that the committee leadership favored Clinton over Sanders and had worked to help Clinton win the nomination. On July 12, 2016, Sanders formally endorsed Clinton in her unsuccessful general election campaign against Republican Donald Trump, while urging his supporters to continue the political revolution his campaign had begun. Unlike the other major candidates, Sanders did not pursue funding through a super PAC or by wealthy donors, instead focusing on small individual donations. His presidential campaign raised $1.5 million within 24 hours of his official announcement. At year's end, the campaign had raised a total of $73 million from more than 1 million people, making 2.5 million donations, with an average donation of $27.16. The campaign reached 3.25 million donations by the end of January 2016, raising $20 million in that month alone. Sanders used social media to help his campaign gain momentum, posting content to online platforms such as Twitter and Facebook and answering questions on Reddit. He gained a large grassroots organizational following online. A July 29, 2015 meetup organized online brought 100,000 supporters to more than 3,500 simultaneous events nationwide. Sanders' June 2015 campaign events drew overflow crowds around the country, to his surprise. When Hillary Clinton and Sanders made public appearances within days of each other in Des Moines, Iowa, Sanders drew larger crowds, even though he had already made numerous stops around the state, and Clinton's visit was her first in 2015. On July 1, 2015, Sanders' campaign stop in Madison, Wisconsin, drew the largest crowd of any 2016 presidential candidate to that date, with an estimated turnout of 10,000. Over the following weeks, he gained even larger crowds, 11,000 in Arizona, 15,000 in Seattle, and 28,000 in Portland. The 2016 Democratic Party presidential debates occurred among candidates in the campaign for the Democratic Party's nomination for the President of the United States. The DNC announced in May 2015 that there will be 6 debates. Critics allege that the small number of debates and the schedule, with half of the debates on Saturday or Sunday nights, were part of the DNC's deliberate attempt to protect the frontrunner, Hillary Clinton. In February 2016, Clinton's and Sanders' campaign agreed in principle to hold 4 more debates for a total of 10. Clinton dropped out of the 10th debate, scheduled to take place just before the California primary, citing a need to devote her time to making direct contact with California voters and preparing for the general election. Sanders expressed disappointment that Clinton canceled the debate before the largest and most important primary in the presidential nominating process. An NBC Wall Street Journal poll conducted in May found Clinton and presumptive Republican nominee Donald Trump in a dead heat, but the same poll found that if Sanders were the Democratic nominee, 53% of voters would support him to 39% for Trump. Clinton and Trump were the least popular likely candidates in the poll's history, while Sanders received a 43% positive, 36% negative rating. Polls showed that Democratic voters older than 50 preferred Clinton by a large margin, but those under 50 overwhelmingly favored Sanders. Some supporters raised concerns that publications such as the New York Times minimized coverage of the Sanders campaign in favor of other candidates, especially Trump's and Clinton's. The Times public editor, or ombudsman, reviewed her paper's coverage of Sanders and found that as of September 2015, her paper hasn't always taken it very seriously. The tone of some stories is regrettably dismissive, even mocking at times. Some of that is focused on the candidate's age, appearance, and style, rather than what he has to say. She also found that the Times coverage of Sanders' campaign was much scanter than its coverage of that of Trump, the Republican candidate, also initially considered a long shot, with 63 articles covering the Trump campaign and 14 covering the Sanders campaign. A December 2015 report found that the 3 major networks, CBS, NBC, and ABC, had spent 234 minutes reporting on Trump and 10 minutes on Sanders, despite their similar polling results. The report noted that ABC World News Tonight had spent 81 minutes on Trump and less than 1 minute on Sanders during 2015. In November 2016, Amy Goodman of Democracy Now! Noted that on March 15, Super Tuesday 3, the speeches of Trump, Clinton, Marco Rubio, and Ted Cruz were broadcast in full. Sanders was in Phoenix, Arizona on that date, speaking to a rally larger than any of the others, but his speech was not mentioned, let alone broadcast. Other analysts disputed that the media was biased against Sanders. According to Vox's Matthew Iglesias, the media was biased in his favor, as it had a systematic self-interested bias towards exaggerating how close the race is. In September 2015, George Washington University political scientist John Sides failed to find evidence that there was less coverage of Sanders than would be expected for a candidate who was considered unlikely to win, saying, "If anything, you could make the case for the opposite, that Sanders is getting more coverage than he should based on his chances of winning, perhaps because the media's framing the Democratic race as competitive makes it more interesting to readers." The media coverage that Sanders did get was far less negative than Clinton's, according to Sides. Jonathan Stray of Harvard University's Nieman Lab found in January 2016 that media coverage of Sanders was proportional to his standings in the poll. A 2016 report by the Harvard Kennedy School's Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy found that Sanders did not get much media coverage in early 2015 due to initial low poll numbers, but as he began to get coverage, it was overwhelmingly positive in tone. Sanders' coverage in 2015 was the most favorable of any of the top candidates, Republican or Democratic, while Clinton received by far the most negative coverage of any candidate. A second 2016 Shorenstein Center report found that Sanders was the only candidate during the primary period to receive a positive balance of coverage, and that the ratio of Clinton-Sanders coverage in 2016 was 54 to 46% in weeks 5 through 11 and 61 to 39% in weeks 12 through 19, while the ratio of Trump-Clinton-Sanders coverage was 43, 37, and 20% in weeks 20 through 24. As the primary progressed, coverage of Sanders was increasingly dominated by his electoral defeats and increasingly smaller chance to win the Democratic nomination. An analysis in Newsweek found that 12% of those who voted for Sanders in the Democratic primary voted for Trump in the general election, enough to swing the election in his favor. By comparison, 25% of those who voted for Clinton in the 2008 Democratic primary voted for Republican nominee John McCain in the general election. After the final primary election, Clinton became the presumptive Democratic nominee. On July 12, Sanders formally endorsed Clinton, and he continued to work with the Democratic National Convention organizers to implement the progressive positions he had been campaigning for. Sanders spoke at the 2016 Democratic National Convention on July 25th, giving Clinton his full support. Some of Sanders' supporters attempted to protest Clinton's nomination and booed when Sanders called for party unity. Sanders responded, "Our job is to do two things: to defeat Donald Trump and to elect Hillary Clinton. It is easy to boo, but it is harder to look your kids in the face if we are living under a Trump presidency." On November 8, in the general election, Sanders received almost 6% of the vote in Vermont, though he was no longer a candidate. This was the highest share of a statewide presidential vote for a write-in draft campaign in American history. He also received more votes in Vermont than Gary Johnson, the Libertarian candidate, and Jill Stein, the Green candidate, combined. It was possible to vote for Sanders as a write-in candidate in 12 states, and exact totals of write-in votes for Sanders were published in 3 of them: California, New Hampshire, and Vermont. In those 3 states, Sanders received 111,850 write-in votes, approximately 15% of the write-in votes nationwide, less than 1% of total nationwide vote. In November 2016, Sanders' book, Our Revolution, A Future to Believe In, was released. Upon its release, it was number 3 on the New York Times bestseller list. The audiobook received a Grammy nomination for Best Spoken Word Album. In 2016, Sanders formed Our Revolution, a political organization dedicated to educating voters about issues, getting people involved in the political process, and electing progressive candidates. In February 2017, he began webcasting The Bernie Sanders Show on Facebook. Polls taken in 2017 found Sanders to be the most popular politician in the United States. In February 2018, Special Counsel Robert Mueller's investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election revealed that Russians communicated false information during the primary campaigns to benefit Sanders and Stein and harm Clinton. Sanders rejected the investigation's conclusion, saying that he had seen no evidence that Russians helped his campaign. He furthermore blamed the Clinton campaign for not doing more to prevent Russian interference. Sanders later said his campaign had taken action to prevent Russian meddling in the election, and that a campaign staffer had alerted the Clinton campaign. Politico noted that a Sanders campaign volunteer contacted a political action committee, PAC, that supported the Clinton campaign to report suspicious activities, but that the Sanders campaign did not contact the Clinton campaign as such. A variety of analysts have suggested that Sanders' campaign shifted both the Clinton campaign and the Democratic Party politically leftward. Speaking on the PBS NewsHour about the upcoming 2018 elections and discussing the main principles of the two major parties, Susan Page described the Republican Party as Trump's party and the Democratic Party as Bernie Sanders' party, saying that Sanders and his more progressive stance had really taken hold. Noting the increased acceptance of Sanders' national single-payer health care program, his $15 an hour minimum wage stance, free college tuition, and many of the other campaign platform issues he introduced. An April 2018 opinion article in The Week suggested, quietly but steadily, the Democratic Party is admitting that Sanders was right. In July 2016, a Slate article called The Democratic Platform Draft, a monument to his campaign, noting not only Sanders' call for a $15 minimum wage, but other Sanders campaign issues, such as Social Security expansion, a carbon tax, Wall Street reform, opposition to the death penalty, and a reasoned pathway for future legalization of marijuana. On March 17, 2016, Sanders said he would support Merrick Garland's nomination to the Supreme Court, though he added, there are some more progressive judges out there. Sanders opposed Neil Gorsuch's nomination to the court, saying that Gorsuch had refused to answer legitimate questions. Sanders also objected to the possibility of Senate Republicans using the nuclear option to choke off debate and ram the nomination through the Senate. He voted against Gorsuch's confirmation as Associate Supreme Court Justice. In April 2017, Sanders introduced a bill that would raise the minimum wage for federal contract workers to $15 an hour, an increase over an earlier Democratic $12 an hour proposal, which was co-sponsored by two other progressive Democrats. On May 9, 2018, Sanders introduced the Workplace Democracy Act, a bill that will expand labor rights by making it easier for workers to join a union, ban right-to-work laws, and some anti-union provisions of the Taft-Hartley Act, and outlaw some union-busting tactics. It was endorsed by several Democratic senators, including Elizabeth Warren, Kirsten Gillibrand, Tammy Baldwin, and Sherrod Brown. Announcing the legislation, Sanders said, "If we are serious about reducing income and wealth inequality and rebuilding the middle class, we have got to substantially increase the number of union jobs in this country." On September 5, 2018, Sanders partnered with Ro Khanna to introduce the Stop Bad Employers by Zeroing Out Subsidies Act, which will require large corporations to pay for food stamps and Medicaid benefits their employees receive, rather than shifting the burden onto taxpayers. Khanna said, if you bag groceries, you should be able to buy groceries. Sanders said, taxpayers in this country should not be subsidizing a guy who's worth $150 billion, whose wealth is increasing by $260 million every single day, referring to Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos. The bill has received some support from conservatives. Fox News pundit Tucker Carlson endorsed the proposal on air. On October 2, 2018, Bezos raised the minimum wage at Amazon to $15, effective November 1st. Sanders commended him. As an independent, Sanders worked out a deal with the Senate Democratic leadership in which he agreed to vote with the Democrats on all procedural matters unless the Democratic whip, Dick Durbin, agreed that he need not, a request rarely made or granted. In return, he was allowed to keep his seniority and receive the committee seats that would have been available to him as a Democrat. In 2013 to 14, He was chairman of the United States Senate Committee on Veterans Affairs. Sanders became the ranking minority member on the Senate Budget Committee in January 2015. He had previously been chair of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee for 2 years. Since January 2017, he has been chair of the Senate Democratic Outreach Committee. He appointed economics professor Stephanie Kelton, a modern monetary theory scholar, as the chief economic advisor for the committee's Democratic minority and presented a report aimed at helping rebuild the disappearing middle class, which included proposals to raise the minimum wage, boost infrastructure spending, and increase Social Security payments. In April 2017, a nationwide Harvard-Harris poll found Sanders had the highest favorability rating of the leading political figures included in the poll, a standing confirmed by subsequent polling. In September 2018, The Guardian published 2 op-ed pieces on the need for international progressive cooperation to challenge the rising threat of globalism, threat of authoritarianism, and wealth inequality, one by Sanders and another by European progressive Yanis Varoufakis. In late October, Varoufakis announced the upcoming launch of Progressives International on November 30th in Vermont. In 2018, Sanders sponsored a bill with Senators Chris Murphy and Mike Lee to invoke the 1973 War Powers Resolution to end U.S. support for the Saudi-led military intervention in Yemen, which has resulted in hundreds of thousands of civilian casualties and millions more suffering from starvation and disease. Sanders first introduced the bill in February 2018, but the Senate voted to table the motion the next month. After the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi in October 2018, which, according to multiple intelligence agencies, was ordered by Saudi Arabian Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, Sanders' bill attracted bipartisan co-sponsors and support, and the Senate passed the bill by a vote of 56 to 41 on December 13th. In a statement after the Senate's passage of the bill, Sanders said the following about his rationale for leading the bipartisan effort to pass it. "I want to stress the bipartisan nature of this legislation. We have brought Republicans and Democrats together in a very historic moment. And what that moment is about is that the Senate this afternoon stated we will not continue participation in the Saudi-led intervention in Yemen, which has resulted in the worst humanitarian crisis on earth. And that crisis is about 85,000 children starving to death, 10,000 new cases of cholera every single week, and the United Nations telling us that Yemen is on the verge of imminent famine, with the possibility of millions of people dying, all because of Saudi activities in that civil war." And today, what the United States Senate said in a very loud way is that we will not continue to have our military posture dictated by a despotic, murderous regime in Saudi Arabia, a regime which does not respect democracy, which does not respect human rights, a regime whose leader, nobody doubts, was involved in a horrific murder of a dissident journalist in the Saudi consulate in Turkey, Jamal Khashoggi. The bill must also be passed by the House and signed by President Trump before it becomes law. If it does, it will be the first ever invocation of the War Powers Resolution. In March 2019, Sanders, along with 7 other members of Congress, including Elizabeth Warren and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, signed a pledge written by veterans and their families to bring a responsible and expedient end to U.S. military interventions around the globe. On February 19, 2019, Sanders announced on Vermont Public Radio that he would seek the Democratic Party's nomination for President of the United States in the 2020 election. On the same day, he announced his campaign in an interview with John Dickerson on CBS This Morning and in an email to his supporters. Sanders had declined the Vermont Democratic Party nomination for U.S. Senate in 2006, 2012, and 2018, which caused an unsuccessful legal challenge to his candidacy for the Democratic presidential nomination in 2016. Along with his 2019 campaign announcement, he said he would abide by a new Democratic Party rule for presidential candidates and would affirm his membership in that party. On March 5, 2019, he signed a formal statement known as a loyalty pledge that he is a member of the Democratic Party and will serve as a Democrat if elected. News reports noted that the day before, he had signed paperwork to run as an independent for re-election to a Senate seat in 2024. Sanders is a self-described democratic socialist and progressive who admires the Nordic model of social democracy and has been a proponent of workplace democracy. In November 2015, he gave a speech at Georgetown University about his view of democratic socialism, including its place in the policies of Presidents Franklin D. Roosevelt and Lyndon B. Johnson. In defining what democratic socialism means to him, Sanders said, "I don't believe government should take over the grocery store down the street or own the means of production. But I do believe that the middle class and the working families who produce the wealth of America deserve a decent standard of living and that their income should go up, not down. I do believe in private companies that thrive and invest and grow in America, companies that create jobs here, rather than companies that are shutting down in America and increasing their profits by exploiting low-wage labor abroad." Based on Sanders' positions and votes throughout his political career, Noam Chomsky and Thomas Frank has described Sanders as a New Dealer. Sanders' campaigns for the Democratic Party's presidential nomination have created controversy about his affiliation. On the 2016 campaign trail, he affirmed that he was a Democrat running for the Democratic nomination. But both Sanders and the Senate website continued to refer to him as an independent senator during and after the campaign. His party status became ambiguous once again in March 2019 when he signed a formal loyalty pledge to the Democratic Party, stating that he is a member of the party and will serve as a Democrat if elected president. He signed the pledge the day after he signed paperwork to run as an independent for re-election to the Senate in 2024. It's not known what the future holds for Sanders or his views or ideologies. Regardless of your views and beliefs, one thing that cannot be argued is the fact that Sanders is, was, and will remain a prominent part of the United States history, looking back and going forward. Feel the burn.
Some of us remember reading in Charles Dickens' books about debt of prisons. Remember that? Debt of prisons. Oh, that was terrible in the 1800s in England. Well, I got news for you. We got debt of prisons in the United States today.